stuff again. Now I see maybe the ear is a bit too high towards here, towards the right there. So I think we can also carve that a bit. Just make a simple mark there and see how it looks. I think it's already looking more like the model here. And look at this relationship here between the nose and the ear. Kind of turns back towards the top side here. So let's make something like that happen there. So yeah, that's looking better now. So maybe it's time to place this ear here as well. And with babies, the proportions are different, so the ear cannot be placed on the same line with the brow, because the brow is pretty low on a baby's head. Like the brow line might be even further than halfway of the whole head, whereas here it was, if you remember, around a third from the hairline. These are rough rules, of course, not like written in stone. Again, babies have unique proportions. That's how we recognize the babies we know. But in general, the main trick to making anything look like it's real is just observe and really take in what you're seeing. And that way, if you put down exactly what you see, it's going to look right. Now, that is not easy. It takes a lot of training to do that, but the concept is very simple. So I think it's kind of ready to start laying some darks and separating the lights from the darks. Basically, I'm probably gonna like dry brush most of everything in here to make it a little bit darker. But yeah, first let me just go ahead and put this kind of line from the pillow in here. I feel it kind of helps with the composition, because then kind of helps your eye stay in the picture here instead of kind of going with this single mass here. I kind of like this composition. It feels like it has very like this organic kind of framing to it, where maybe the baby is even in the focus. Yeah, I don't know. I like it. I'm happy with this. Usually I like to paint from photos I've taken myself. It isn't the case here, so working from a photo like this is really a pleasure. Let's just place the baby hand roughly here as well. Actually, I'm seeing here that the sleeve needs to come actually a little bit further here, and the hand starts a bit earlier in here. So let's erase what we did there. Now, this is kind of just a pretty abstract placement for this stuff. Yeah, so I guess I'll just start first with mapping shadow edges. And I think I'll just mark this with something that is somewhat darker than the stuff we put down first, so we can keep those lines even after we tone things in. Here I'm just kind of making the shadow edge a little bit broken, so it looks more like there's fabric folding. I mean, that's what's happening in the image, but I'm not following it strictly, because this is one of those things where you can use creative license as long as the folds look believable. But it's just more fun this way. I can actually put a little bit of creativity in here, and it's something that doesn't have to be so strictly drawn to proportion. One thing you have to keep in mind though is that these still describe forms. So light is coming from this side, shadow is on this side here. So we do have to keep in mind that the general edge of the shadow is going in here, because here it turns towards the shadow side all the way, and on the shoulder it goes like this. So these creases kind of describe that. So you can't go just ham with the creases or anything like this. I'm not doing this from my head, but kind of roughly copying. So And on the arm here, it's good to keep in mind the anatomy. I think around here we have the wristwatch. I think we'll paint that, but leave it quite painterly. Depending on the person, the wristwatch can be, something very iconic, or it might just be an accessory that they happen to wear on that particular day. But better not leave it out, because at least not without discussing with the client, because it might be something very, very important to them, and maybe they're always checking their watch and it's always the same watch, which is very dear to them. So you want to keep those things in unless you discuss. Now, probably something like curtains in the background is what you can of course change. You don't you don't have to keep the very beloved curtains in the picture, but if it's more close to the person you're painting and it's what you're seeing on the image, then of course you can leave it in. Just make it work with the image. Now, if this was like what I'm painting here is a dark wristwatch, I'm just gonna kind of mass it in here and look for the strap here. But yeah, if this was like a screaming red wristwatch or something weird, yellow, I don't know. They probably don't even make something like that. But if it was something that was clearly like distracting, taking away from the composition, then I would just not paint it. In this case, it's like a nice detail. The watch is mostly in shadow. There's like a little highlight in here, basically. It's not very light in value, so it's not taking away from the focal point that is over here. So I want to leave it in. The amount of light hitting this forearm is actually fairly minimal. It's only like this sliver. It's like rim lit, basically. And rim lighting means when the edge is lit and the rest is in shadow. I guess this image is mostly, it is kind of a rim lighting situation now that I think of it, yeah. So it's not like your standard portrait lighting where, it would be like 3/4 view and coming from the top left or whatever, where you have most of the face in light and a portion of it in shadow, so you get nice forms to paint actually. This would be kind of something I would call a more narrative portrait, because it's clearly describing a situation that's happened, and it's interesting in that way. Now you can see here, I'm kind of reinforcing the drawing here, and it's leaving this dark mark, which is exactly the opposite of what I want. Like, this is going to be light here, but I just have to place it somehow so that I can actually then go and erase the crisper lines here. Sometimes it's a bit unintuitive when you're painting lights or trying to map out the lights. Like here, there's only a sliver at the edge. There's basically the outline is light. I've placed it in shadow. I mean not shadow, but with a dark line. So I'm gonna have to change that when I'm actually going through this in painting. It's good to keep those things in mind. Think about what you're doing, why you're doing it. There's a story that someone told about our teacher, Jared, who actually, well, in a later stage of painting, where we're looking into planes of light, and of course refining the image. Then someone, when he was younger and a student teacher, I think at that time, he would just sit down and observe the painting for like 15 minutes at a time, looking very intently, and then go and make a single mark on the picture and then repeat the process. So that's just an extreme example of how you can be really, really precise and accurate and think everything ahead, and then execute very sharply and precisely. That's like, to me, it's like the ideal way of painting, but of course maybe 15 minutes per brushstroke is a bit excessive. And of course, I mean, that's a story I've heard, not from Jared himself, but perhaps some other faculty, or I can't remember. So the 50 minutes might be a tiny bit exaggerated, but yeah, okay. So I catch myself going into almost like articulation here, looking for the shadow shape on this finger edge here and all that stuff. So maybe it's better to actually leave this for later instead of kind of trying to go for that now. So maybe actually a smarter approach would have been to tone this whole thing in and then come back and wipe off the lights. So now kind of maybe I just kind of reinforced my idea of the drawing here. That's kind of what I achieved with this. I'll just, since I'm here, I'll just mark out where I think the separation for these fingers will be. Here between the fingers, if you look, there's this kind of webbing thing, not webbing actually, but I don't know what to call this, skin fold. That kind of takes the separation between the fingers higher up than the knuckles, because if you were just looking at knuckles, the edge would be somewhere like here, because there's this rhythm of the knuckles going like this. But actually the separation happens somewhere between here because there's this extra skin between the fingers. Yeah, so I think that's enough for that area. I think what I now want to do is start actually mapping those shadows on these figures here. Now it's a bit tricky, like if you have a single light source and a very distinct division between light and shadow, it's going to be easy to draw the shadow edge there. But here I actually have to make decisions like how much information will I put in the shadows at this stage, because pretty much all of this is in shadow. This is the only spot of actual light, direct light hitting the subject here. So if I want to group the whole thing in shadow, then I'm just gonna paint everything from here on down into one single raw umber value and lose all my drawing. So maybe that's not the ideal way to approach this. So maybe I'll go for like two tones. I'll go for a darker shadow value and then the average shadow value and try to work with that. So I can get, you always have to think what the goal for your drawing here is. So it's obviously to add information, not just kind of take it away. It would be ridiculous if I just use like better part of an hour to map this stuff out and then just smudge it all out, and I would basically end up with a blurry silhouette of this image. Now that also would be helpful. I would still have the silhouette, and that already is a good starting point for a painting. But since I found more information from the image, then may as well try to retain that information and use it. In some cases, it's good to lose that stuff if say your shadow value and background value are similar and the edge is soft, then you don't want to keep that line there. There's no need for that. But looking at features, the details of the ear, the shadow at the back of the head here, like the occlusion shadow or ambient occlusion shadow here, for example, would be easier to map in, and it separates the head from the rest of the kind of foreground here nicely. So it would be silly to lose that and just kind of let this head float here, like when I can just describe it in a single value pretty nicely. So maybe what I'll do is actually I'll start with those, and after that I can be a bit more free with the description of this average shadow tone. So right now I'm taking more of this raw umber mixture. Well, not mixture, it's just from the tube to describe this darker shadow tone. And as you can see, once I increase the contrast here, it's starting to look like these lines are non-existent, because our eye goes here and you kind of lose the these don't look so contrasty anymore after adding this tone here. So now it looks like these lines are super light and it's barely visible. It's something you want to keep in mind. Make the lines dark enough, but not very dark, during this dry brush stage. Because it can be quite annoying if you make a nice drawing and then you kind of lose track of where it is when you're doing this softer, darker stuff around. And I want to point out that I'm still keeping this soft. I'm not like looking to actually, make any crisp lines, even though I see some very sharp things here. But that manipulation of edges and stuff like this will come later on in the painting. For now, it's easier to just keep it soft and try to stick to that. It's easier to sharpen things than soften things in oil paint. Sharpening is basically just making a brush stroke, but if you want to soften things, then you have to go blur it with possibly multiple brushes from different directions to make the softness you want. So it's obviously easier to just lay down paint and do that. So rather make things softer than sharper. That's also part of realism, like softening things strategically, because our eye doesn't actually see everything as sharp. It just sees the kind of the focal point, or let's say the area in our retina that sees sharply is fairly limited in its field of view. It's like, I don't know if I remember correctly, it's like 15 degrees or something. So basically everything you see around is gonna be blurred out. Obviously you can't really see that because you turn your eyes and you see that clearly then. But it's just how our vision works, and like discovering that can be difficult. So if you make everything softer, then you can sharpen things in the focal area to make them grab more attention. And at the same time, that might actually make it look more realistic, because without us usually knowing it, we actually see that way. I mean, I'm not talking about like a photographic blur everything here, but you know, it's maybe less detailed and softer in places, you know. So the answer for realism isn't to grab like a makeup blending brush or something like this and just go over everything. That might work sometimes, but you know, most cases you have to actually like consider every single edge you make basically. So, well, this is a bad place to discuss it, but you know, if I have this shadow shape here that is kind of describing the form of this head, and there's actually a cast shadow from a pillow here. If this area is light and this background here is light, then of course this edge is going to appear less contrasty because they're pretty close in value to each other. But you know, if I have this kind of dark shadowy area here, and this is lighter than that, then this edge is going to appear sharper and more contrasty. And so you have to consider each of these edges separately. For example, here where it's shadow, here where it's in light but turning away from the light source, which means this would be a darker turning tone here. And in here it will be like the lightest light where it's basically rimlit, and this would be very sharp, especially if it's darker in the background, let's say. Then we would have like almost a highlight in here. And having this hierarchy of edges would be it would be good for the realism, and that's something we did in the still lives in the school Angel Academy where I attended. But yeah, this is going into pretty complex stuff, so maybe we can tackle edges in another video. That was a bit of a tangent, so yeah, let's keep drawing. I want to mention I'm not using any medium here since this is like dry brushing, so raw umber as a color dries very quickly. Yeah, it has this drying kind of salt. They're called cicatives as a group, but I think it was like manganese. That was the drying agent in raw umber that, or well, umbers generally, that makes them dry really quickly. Adding umbers into your other mixtures will also help them dry faster. So, you know, adding raw umber to your white, if you don't need the full white, will actually make it dry faster. Not like crazy amounts, but you know, generally that's how it works. So that's part of the reason why I use this raw umber for underpainting. It is something I'm used to because we used it at school. But also that's probably one of the reasons why it's used in schools is because you're drawing, painting every day. If you have at least one paint mixture or paint you don't have to add dryers to, then that's great. And also the color is this nice kind of warm brown yellow. Yeah, so this is distracting me a little bit here, so let me just wipe it off. I'm just kind of making this flat shape out of this so I can knock down the value a little bit. So here it's not so distracting anymore. Also something that's kind of bothering me is this weird line here, so let's get rid of it. If we can, maybe it's from the toning of the canvas, but yeah, I think it's from the toning of the canvas, so can't really do much about it. It kind of looks like the nose is continuing into this eyebrow, which it isn't. So maybe we can kind of adjust the drawing a little bit by adding this kind of shadow here. I'm gonna put it in anyway at a later point, so now we can see that the bridge of the nose actually kind of turns towards the, is it glabella or whatever it's called, this kind of keystone shape here between the eyes. So here I'm looking for this edge of the light and the shadow. It's really soft in here, so just gonna try to kind of mark it like I see it. This comes a little bit more towards here. Okay, so we're kind of getting into the feature area here where there is a bit of light showing. So we'll just try to kind of roughly place that here with simple lines. So that is the nose and the forehead and glabella kind of casting a shadow towards here. So that's why I made this mark. So it's good to be analytical, like what you're placing down, why is it good for the picture. And here I'm placing the continuation of that cast shadow along the form of the cheekbone there. So yeah, that's pretty much it for that side. So maybe then